Right. So I'm going to ask you about Rousseau and Kant and where they should be categorized, and Rand's view of Kant in regard to the Enlightenment. But let's just listen.
That is from history, tradition, and experience. But this Enlightenment view is not only wrong, it's dangerous. Human reason, when cut loose from the constraints imposed by history, tradition, and experience, produces a lot of crazy notions. The abstract Enlightenment philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a good example. It quickly pulled down the French state, leading to the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, and the Napoleonic Wars. Millions died as Napoleon's army sought to rebuild every government in Europe in light of the one correct political theory he believed was permitted by Enlightenment philosophy. Today's cheerleader.
So I want to talk about I mean, again, you can see some of the agenda here, right? Napoleon is the anti-nationalist. And one of the big themes in Hazony's book is that there is no one correct political system. And that's why you need nations to basically develop their own, which is consistent with their culture and their character, whatever. And that this idea of Napoleon imposing one correct political system is his great evil. So you can see kind of the nationalist agenda coming out of this. But before we get to that, I want you guys to talk about Kant and Rousseau's positioning as Enlightenment thinkers, which, I mean, Pica puts them there. Hazony obviously puts them there. And of course, Rand views them both as the destroyers of the Enlightenment, as destroyers of the ideas of the Enlightenment. So I'm curious to see how you you guys talk about it.
One thing is we should talk about, none of us are experts in particular on this period. So one thing to talk about is just how do you learn about and think about a period like this, where there are a lot of different figures. And so I just, before we go into Rousseau and Kant and each of these philosophers, who individually you can spend a lifetime studying, and then you can spend a lifetime studying the history, a couple of good resources to start with, just for people who don't want to take our word for it, and you shouldn't take our word for any of this. And part of what makes these good resources is that they contain lots of links to other things and to original sources. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which you can find online at plato.stanford.edu, is a not always great, but pretty good reference resource on philosophy. And they have a really good article on the Enlightenment by William Bristow, who's more or less a Kant and post-Kantian scholar, but it's a very good summary of the different intellectual trends in the Enlightenment. You can so find that online. There's a pretty good, I think, from Penguin, Enlightenment Reader that I really like, that has samples of different views from this, and a really good introduction by, what's the name of the guy? By Kramnik. And Alan Kors, who people may know, he's written some, has a wonderful speech on the Soviet Union and how people minimize socialism and so forth. Edited, I think, an encyclopedia of the Enlightenment, which you can get in a couple of volumes or take out from the library, where you can read around in and find a lot. So there are a lot of good books. Those are just three kind of reference kind of things you might start with. Now, one thing you find if you look at some of those sources is what are the kind of tensions that are taking place intellectually in this period. And a dominant strain in Enlightenment thought is having a secularized view of ethics, where understood in one way or another, human happiness is the ultimate goal, individual happiness. And so we're thinking for individuals, what is happiness? And there are debates about just what it is. Is it just the satisfaction of your desires? Is it pleasure? Is it something else? How do we understand it? But there's human happiness. Individuals are and should be trying to pursue and seek their happiness. And societies are good insofar as they make that possible. And then political freedom is valued as a means to happiness. And you find different versions of this in different thinkers. Again, lots of disagreements. Locke is maybe a kind of clearest case of this kind of thinking. What you get in Rousseau is a kind of lauding of freedom as distinct from and better than happiness, and a kind of view of freedom which is sort of real freedom only exists when you're a kind of view of freedom that actually goes back to Plato, where freedom amounts to having all of your desires be correct and correctly governed, and that might mean governed by other people. And you get this emphasis on freedom and heterodox view of freedom becomes very central to Kant's ethical thinking. There's more to say about Kant, but essentially on his ethics, Kant thinks about morality is about freedom. And freedom is in effect about being motivated in some way other than by your own happiness. And so you get a whole anti-happiness ethics. So that's one thing that's going on from Rousseau to Kant. The other thing that's going on in this video is the move from Rousseau to the French Revolution. And let's talk, I want to hear Onkar on Rousseau and Kant, but we should also spend some time on like the relevance of the French Revolution here, because this is not just by Hazony and a few other critics, generally thought to be, there was the Enlightenment in France and then this reign of terror, and that did a lot to discredit the Enlightenment at the time. But and that Rousseau has a role in.
One thing I think worth saying about Rousseau, so he's taken here as obviously an Enlightenment figure, and that's because he's writing during the period that you would say, well, okay, these are the years of the Enlightenment. But it's worth knowing that a lot of people at the time took him as an enemy of progress, an enemy of man, an enemy of civilization, and were fighting him on these issues and say, you're going to take us backwards, and it's too much irreverence of the instinctual and the primitive. So and this goes to the issue. It's not one school of thought. It's broad trends, and there's disagreement in regard to it. And there's real, there are opponents, I think, of when the Enlightenment is going on. And I think it's right to think of Rousseau as largely, not completely, but largely opposed to the central ideals of the Enlightenment.
And this is concretely, there's a famous letter from Voltaire, who's a kind of canonical French Enlightenment thinker, to Rousseau, kind of sarcastically saying, I forget the exact, like, your book made me want to go back on all fours and crawl around in the muck. So this is not, you can go search on Voltaire and Rousseau and you'll find this kind of stuff.
So say something about Rand's view of the Enlightenment and the role particularly Kant plays in the history of ideas in this context.
I'll say one thing about the Enlightenment, which is she always puts the credit to the Renaissance, that the turning point and the rediscovery of reason is the Renaissance. And so I think for sure she thinks of the Enlightenment as flowing out of the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the ancient world. And when we're talking about rediscovery of the ancient world, I think it's important. It doesn't just mean the rediscovery of Aristotle, though it certainly includes that, and that's coming a bit earlier in the medieval period. But when you go and look at Renaissance Italy and what they're rediscovering in terms of buildings, art, architecture, and just sort of the methodology of doing things that they're learning, that, you can study the world and learn things and progress. And they've done that. And so when we talk about miracles, when they started rediscovering the stuff from ancient Greece, but particularly ancient Rome, it was miraculous to them. Like, how could anybody do it? It's like they're discovering the alien civilization. How could anybody do this? And then they dedicated themselves to starting to learn. And so she put that as that's the pivotal moment. And so for sure her view is it has a broad historical lineage and then coming out of it, it's gradually getting out of religion. And I think the Enlightenment period is when science has been established. It's kind of incontestable that modern science has advanced knowledge beyond anything that was previously known. So they've surpassed the ancients. Mm-hmm. And now religion is really on the defensive as a result. And that's the Enlightenment period, but it's coming out of the Renaissance.
Greg, did you want to say something about Rand's view?
I mean, the main thing is that she's seeing it as this continuous thing, thinking of it as the Renaissance. When she thinks of the Enlightenment specifically, she's speaking about the kind of period of Locke, and she's more focused on the failures to make good on some of the epistemic, some of what was needed epistemologically there. And we could talk about what she saw as the failures. It's Leonard Peikoff in his work on this that was endorsed by Rand that really started emphasizing the Enlightenment culture as when these ideas from the Renaissance, captured the culture more fully and led to the formation of America. Rand thought they did lead to the formation of America and capitalism and so forth, but she didn't venerate the term Enlightenment in the same way. In her own writing, she did, though, endorse things in which Leonard wrote that way. Mm-hmm. One other thing on Rousseau, by the way, that we should say, the reason that Rousseau is seen as an Enlightenment figure is not only that he was writing in this period in France, so that's part of it, but it's also that he was writing a lot about social contracts and the relationship between government and the people. And the idea of a social contract is a major theme running through Enlightenment thought. The idea that government is based on the will of the people in some sense, or the judgment of the people, or it doesn't have some authority that comes from outside of the people. It somehow comes from the people themselves. And you get different versions of this view in Hobbes and others in Locke, and then in Rousseau. And that's one reason why Rousseau is seen as a major figure here. But Rousseau's view represents a real departure from Locke's view and a real, in effect, pro-mobocracy view. And if you look at the kind of influences, the American framers were very, very anti the kind of rule by the majority, the general will of the people kind of ideas that get their fullest expression in Rousseau, and then in the Jacobins in France. So they're all part of this intellectual foment about rethinking authority, rethinking the relationship between the people and government. But there are very different views of it in Locke and Rousseau, and they animate very different revolutions in America and France. And not just those two, there's also the Glorious Revolution in England, which can be seen as Lockean. Locke's main works on this were published just after it, but he was, a part of the political factionalism going on in England at the time. And there's the Haitian Revolution, which is a little bit more arguable what was going on there, but a lot of people think there were Rousseauvian influences on it.
You also asked about Kant.
Yeah.
And I think and particularly Rand's view of Kant. And I think it's important that she thinks he's very conscious of what he's doing. So Greg had put it that he's anti-happiness in morality. And this is, if you think of the Enlightenment, and if you take the Declaration of Independence as capturing the spirit, it's government should be protecting your pursuit of happiness. That, again, is an idea and formulated like that, that's new in the Enlightenment. And so consciously turning against that is a major, major issue. And it's not just consciously turning against that. She thinks he understood what the basic issue was, that the last issue for reason to rethink was the issue of morality. So they've done it in science, they've done it in even political thought. They've rethought from crucial errors. And now instead of trying to have a fully grounded morality that sanctions the pursuit of happiness, he turns against that and knows that what he has to do is isolate morality from the power of reason. And here means of scientific, a proper view of reason, that he has to separate morality from that. And his whole philosophy is doing that. Reason is okay in science, so it doesn't really get to the real world. So that's what morality is about. And it's a different domain and different standards. And she thinks it's not just, that's the result of his philosophy. That's what he's trying to do. And that makes him a major, major villain in the history of thought.
So somebody asks about that segment. They ask, Hazony says, reason comes up with crazy things. So he's asking, where does that come from?
Fear. If you're a hidebound traditionalist, if you're afraid of challenging the things your rabbi taught you, if you're afraid of reality, then reason's scary. And then you can find people who claim to be pro-reason who did actual bad things that you can use to rationalize that. But I think it comes up, I don't think it's an honest claim.
Yep.
Reason comes up with crazy, scary things. That is...
Well, he goes directly into Rousseau from there and into Napoleon and Napoleonic Wars, and he blames reason for the death of millions of people because of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars.
And of the Enlightenment people, if you want to even call him Enlightenment, Rousseau is not a big advocate of reason and science, right?
No.
I mean, Rousseau thinks the sciences are mostly mistakes. It's all, I mean, he's the least pro-reason character in this period, even by his own statements on it. I mean, not like you can interpret him as subtly trying to undermine reason. Kant, you know, says he's pro-reason and reason's really important, although he's critiquing it, you know, at its limits. That's how he portrays himself. But Rousseau is not, that's just not, Rousseau is, you know, much more about natural states and passions and so forth.
And the other person he's going to bring up in a few seconds in the video is Marx as an example of and Marx too turns against logic, and there's supposedly bourgeois thought and proletarian and the irreconcilable, and it's just your class determines your thinking. It's deterministic. It's heavily non-rational, irrational. And late in the video, there's a sort of admission. Well, yeah, this was dogmatism, which I think is the right view of things. And when you get to the kind of political expression of the French Revolution or of communism, this is just a secularized religion. And it doesn't make religion look good. Like, it's not, oh, what we need is a supernatural version of this. It's, we don't need any of this, secular or supernatural.
There's also a kind of dishonest potshot character to this video. So what's scary and wrong about Kant is he's universalist. He thinks there's some universal thing. Well, in what sense is Kant universalist? In precisely the sense in which Marx isn't. So everybody who's honest thinks that there are some universal truths, including Hazony, right? Who thinks that, you know, it's a universal truth that we shouldn't impose the same government on everyone everywhere, right? Yep. So everyone who's honest, who's not BSing themselves about it, thinks, because what it is to be true is to be true. Existence exists, things are what they are, and truth is truth. So truths are universal if they're true. The thing that's controversial about the universality of Kant is that he deals in very grand abstractions, that's one. And two, that he thinks the structures by which he thinks the mind conditions our thought are universal and shared by everybody. And the critique of Kant that he's too universalist, which comes from Hegel and Marx and all the people after him, is that no, you know, the rich people and the poor people and the Europeans and the Indians and the this and the that, they have different structures because they're at different stages in the historical process that structure their minds. And so it's more local. Yep. But then Marx is accused as being the same in the same camp as Kant. He's being criticized for the same things, even though they disagree about what was allegedly what was wrong with Kant in the first place. So it's the kind of thinking that you see in political hucksters. There's not an attempt to figure out, like, what's the essence of this guy? What's the essence of, maybe you get him wrong, but you're trying to figure out what's the essence that distinguishes this view from that view. Then is it good or bad? And why do I think it's good or bad? What does it lead to? Rather, you're looking for a way to take pot shots at each person that you've put on the team you don't like. And you're not thinking about whether those pot shots are even consistent.
And you know that Hazony is going to be a universalist when he's critiquing the left, right? When he's critiquing postmodernism or critiquing some other Marx or whatever, then he's suddenly become a universalist, or the virtue of nationalism, which is universal.
Part of what's disturbing about this is a kind of leftist critique, what used to be a leftist critique, that what in the 60s would have been the kind of leftist, new left critique of the Enlightenment is what we're getting here.
Well, there's very much, in almost every realm, there seems to be this convergence between left and right, so intellectually.
Down through history, various political and philosophical movements have sprung up, but most of them have died. Some, however, like democracy or communism, take hold and affect the entire world. Here in the United States, perhaps the most challenging and unusual new philosophy has been forged by a novelist, Ayn Rand. Miss Rand's point of view is still comparatively unknown in America, but if it ever did take hold, it would revolutionize our lives. And Ayn, to begin with, I wonder if I can ask you to capsulize, I know this is difficult, can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it, and that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, a morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
How does objectivism differ from the philosophies that many of us have been exposed to in our youths? Philosophies based upon religions, theologians, dogmatists.
The very first difference, objectivism tells you that it is not right, it is not proper to man to take anything on faith. Religion is a matter of faith. You accept a religion emotionally or because you were born to it. You have not chosen it rationally. What objectivism will tell you is that reason, man's reason, is his basic means of survival. That is the most important faculty which he has, and he has to guide his life and make his choices by means of his rational faculty. He has to make his own choices, but he has to know how to make them. It is immoral for him to act on his emotions, to be guided by the whim of the moment. That objectivism holds as very wrong, very immoral. And morality, in fact, consists of following your reason to the best of your ability. So that rationality is the basic virtue from which all the others proceed.
My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people, nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
Tell me the value of selfishness.
Use another word, self-esteem. The value of selfishness is that you esteem yourself as a value, that you live according to your nature, which means by the judgment of your own mind, and you respect your own mind, you respect your own ability to do the right thing, therefore you respect the possibility of being a morally virtuous person, and you regard yourself as a value worth preserving. To make a success of yourself in any line of rational activity is a great virtue. And people will attack you for exercising your ability, for hard work, for consistency, for ambition. And they will want to make you feel guilty of it. That is the greatest evil, according to my philosophy.
And wait, say that again. The greatest evil, according to your philosophy, is to attack an individual because of virtue.
What I call it is to experience or act on hatred of the good for being the good. That is attacking people for their virtues, for their achievements, for anything they have which is a value, actually, not for their flaws and not for their evil. In fact, people who preach that are the ones who are mawkish about the evil people, the failures, the liars, the cheats. Everybody who is weak suddenly acquires some kind of value. But anyone who is a success has to be attacked for his success.
And look at how you have been attacked.
Oh, I know.
How you have been criticized. That there are
You know that?
There are many people in this country, forgive me, in this world who think you're daft.
They don't. They want you to sing that.
Using the super chat, and I noticed yesterday when I appealed for support for the show, many of you stepped forward and actually supported the show for the first time. So I'll do it again. Maybe we'll get some more today. If you like what you're hearing, if you appreciate what I'm doing, then I appreciate your support. Those of you who don't yet support the show, please take this opportunity. Go to yaronbrookshow.com/support or go to subscribestar.com, Yaron Brook Show, and make a kind of a monthly contribution to keep this going. I'm not sure when the next